Okay, well, that's the Sunday papers. Now we'll go to our feature interview, and this morning it's with the Treasurer, Swan, who is in Washington for meetings on the global economy. I pre-recorded this interview with him just an hour ago. Treasurer Swan, good morning and welcome.
Good morning, Barry. It's good to be with you.
It was 2 years ago, almost to the day, that you were in the United States and you were shaken by what you saw and heard. You described the global economy as balancing on the edge of a cliff. How different is it this time?
Well, Barry, sitting around the table with other finance ministers, the strength of the Australian economy stands in very stark contrast to that of other developed economies. Of course, today, 2 years ago, and indeed this evening, was the time when we had an emergency meeting of G20 finance ministers, which was addressed by then President George Bush. And we knew then that the global economy was about to fall off a cliff. And of course it was that evening that I plugged into a cabinet conversation in Canberra time, to take part in confirming the government's decision that we would put in place the bank guarantees that secured the flow of credit to Australian business and to the Australian economy, and took the decision to put in place the first stimulus package, which of course put a floor under confidence and secured the Australian economy over Christmas 2 years ago. So there's a stark contrast with all of that. Those two decisions were two of the most historic decisions that have ever been taken by Australian governments, and they were very effective. And the effectiveness of our stimulus, both fiscal and monetary, is on show for all to see here in Washington 2 years on.
So what do you tell other finance ministers? What do you think is the most important thing that they should know?
Well, I think the most important thing that we must do is to continue to reform the global economy. We are working our way through a set of reforms internationally which will reform the international financial system, and those matters will be discussed extensively by the G20 in Seoul in a month's time. And also, through the G20, we are working on a framework for sustained and balanced growth. A framework for sustained and balanced growth that will deal with some of the very big challenges in the international economy. Because as you know, there's very much a two-speed international economy at the moment. Emerging economies are growing quite strongly, but of course growth in Western economies, developed economies, apart from Australia, is generally very weak. And those are challenges that have been the focus of discussion in all of the meetings that I've been in through the last 24 hours.
So what is the mood then of the finance ministers from those Western countries? Just how much anxiety is there about the economy?
Well, I think the global outlook is fragile. Emerging economies are growing strongly, but growth in developed economies is anemic. So essentially, ministers from those economies are really looking at putting in place a range of reforms which are essential to long-term growth. The G20 in Toronto some months ago set for advanced economies the goal of halving their deficits by 2013. Of course, in Australia, we're back to surplus by 2013. So fiscal consolidation is very much on their mind. But they also know that they've got to do something to support demand. So in some economies, there is a further preoccupation with what more can be done to support domestic demand. For example, I think you've seen during the week a further stimulus package put together by the Japanese, for example. On the other side of the ledger, many economies are looking at the challenges which are posed by differing exchange rate mechanisms in different parts of the world. They're also looking at what other structural reforms can be put in place which can lift growth globally. For example, what can we do in the area of trade to further lift growth?
But in the United States, of course, they've got a massive debt. How conscious are they of that, and what are the prospects of a strong recovery in the near term?
Well, certainly growth is around 2% here, and you saw those employment figures that came out a couple of days ago. Many in the States regarded those as disappointing. Could I just give you this figure, Barry? In the middle of 2007, the unemployment rate in Australia and the unemployment rate in the United States was the same. It had a 4 in front of it. Our unemployment rate is now 5.1%. In the United States, it's 9.6%. They have shed something like 6 million jobs. So there is a real focus in the United States as to what they can further do to support employment, to support jobs and to support business investment.
But they have a massive debt. Are they up to that challenge?
They certainly are up to that challenge, and the President has put in place an independent commission which is dealing with the challenges of fiscal sustainability. You see, in our case, Barry, that when we put in place our stimulus, we also put in place our plans for recovery. So when we announced our second stimulus package in February of 2009, we also announced a range of strict fiscal rules which would govern the return to surplus. Those fiscal rules are now in place, and we are returning to surplus in 3 years early. There's no other developed economy who can say that they're doing that.
What is it like travelling in the United States right at the moment with the dollar where it is?
Well, certainly I haven't been out to the shops, but I certainly would imagine there are a number of Australian tourists here who are enjoying their visits. Of course, the high dollar reflects the strength, the underlying strength of the Australian economy. It also reflects the confidence of the investment community. So there was strong inward investment into Australia.
But if the Australian dollar was to reach parity, and it just might any day now, is that a reason for Australians generally to celebrate?
Well, I don't speculate about the path of the Australian dollar, but I can talk about the reasons why the Australian dollar is strong at the moment, and that does reflect our underlying economic strength. It reflects our low unemployment rate. It reflects strong investment in the Australian economy and therefore strong growth. But of course that does pose challenges for certain sectors of the economy. Many people, for example, who are buying imported goods would be pleased that they're cheaper, but many others, particularly in manufacturing and also in tourism, would certainly feel the effects of a higher dollar. But we have a floating exchange rate, and we've had a floating exchange rate for over 25 years.
I'm not asking you to speculate on the dollar, but if we were to reach parity, given that it's a mixed blessing in a way, is that something Australians should celebrate?
Well, I think they should celebrate the strength of our economy, which that level would indicate. We have a very strong economy. It is being reflected in the strength of the dollar, and that's a good thing for Australia that our economy is so strong. It's a great thing for Australia that employment in Australia is so strong. To have an unemployment rate here, almost half the unemployment rate in the United States, is something that all Australians should be proud of.
And then when you look at the losers, and tourism, manufacturing, farmers among them, with the dollar appreciating about 22% since the middle of the year, is there anything that you can do for them to get them over this short-term problem, if that's what it is?
Well, it makes us doubly determined to put in place a productivity agenda, the productivity agenda that we brought to office in 2007. We've got to redouble our efforts in that area. And of course, in our last budget, I announced a range of measures to address the challenges of a two-speed economy. And I said then that a higher dollar would have adverse impacts, particularly for some of our industrial sectors. And that's why we think we should be bringing down company taxation for companies, to make all of our companies more competitive over time. It's why we do need to be investing in infrastructure. It's why we need to be investing in skills. We've got to redouble our efforts to make sure we are as competitive as possible.
And, of course, as this happens, some company profits will fall. Does it follow then that government revenue from taxation falls as well, and that will have an impact on the budget, bottom line?
Well, Barry, there are swings and roundabouts. There are benefits for revenue, and of course there may be some impacts on the downside for revenue. We'll just have to wait and see as we prepare the budget what the overall net impact of that is. But there are certainly swings and roundabouts, and there's no doubt that a high dollar will impact on company profitability.
Now, China is keeping their currency down to protect local industries. The Canadian Treasurer has said that he's concerned about that. Are you saying anything to the Chinese about that? Are you urging them to revalue?
Well, what I would say in discussions with other finance ministers will remain confidential with them, but what I can say publicly, Barry, is that reform of exchange rate regimes, along with many other structural reforms in developed economies, such as what they may do with their pension systems, what they may do in their health systems and so on, are all on the G20 agenda and will be discussed in Seoul. Exchange rate regimes are one very important area of reform, but there are other important areas of reform which must accompany exchange rate reform.
Is it an exaggeration, as one finance minister put it, that that the world is facing a currency crisis?
I certainly wouldn't use those words, Barry. We have a challenge when it comes to exchange rate reform, just as we have a challenge in terms of reform across developed economies. They have to lift their growth potential, and those are matters that do need to be dealt with in a coordinated way. One thing that the world showed in the face of the global financial crisis and the global recession was that we can be very effective when all countries, in particularly the G20 countries, come together and work together. We showed what we could do. Because of that, we did ward off the worst impacts of the global recession. Now there are another set of challenges, and I think the G20 is up to meeting those challenges, and that's what will be discussed when the G20 meets in Seoul in a few months' time.
There are still some business leaders here in Australia who say they feel intimidated, if not threatened, in their dealings with the government. Why do you think that is the case?
Well, I don't accept that is the case. If leaders or business leaders want to put a point of view to me, my door is always open. I'm constantly talking to business leaders. I welcome their contribution to the public debate. I don't always agree with what every business leader says, and certainly I have discussions with business leaders from time to time where there is not agreement, but I certainly welcome their contribution to the public debate. My door is always open to business leaders, as is the doors of other ministers as well. I welcome their contribution to the public debate, and as we go forward, I hope we continue to see that.
And taxation reform, of course, will be a big part of Labor's second term. What would be your message then to the business community?
Well, my message to the business community is participate in that discussion. We do have the Henry Review on the table. I know many business leaders have got firm views about the direction in which they want to go. My message to them is that we have to be realistic about what can be achieved. I do believe it is desirable that over time we bring down corporate taxes, but if we're going to do that, that has a cost to revenue. So, for example, those that are arguing for a very big corporate tax cut and may also, say, be arguing for a substantial increase in education spending, the onus will also be on them to say where they think we can actually make the savings to fund those sorts of initiatives. The fact is that we have put in place a very strict fiscal regime which is bringing us back to surplus in 3 years. We have to have the tax debate in that context, and that puts an obligation on everybody to be responsible in the suggestions that they put forward so that they fit within our fiscal framework.
But you won't be presenting them with a take it or leave it attitude?
No, not at all. I welcome the discussion. I welcome the discussion not just from the business community, but the community more broadly, the community sector and so on. I welcome that discussion. Always have and always will.
Treasurer, thanks for your time this morning.
Good to be with you.